Well, you're not leaving anytime soon. Martin Luther says that when you wash your face or you get stuck out in the rain, God is reminding you of your baptism. That in that physical sign of water, we are reminded of the waters of grace that have washed us clean and brought us into the family of God. Plenty of reminder today. We've been talking through this Easter season about what it means for us to live after Easter, to be Easter people. We've talked about how with Thomas we are people who ask questions, who learn and who grow. How with Peter we are people who have been forgiven, who become forgivers. With the apostles on the road to Emmaus, and with Paul on the road to Damascus, we are people who are transformed by our experience of the risen Lord Jesus. We're getting close to the end of Easter. Next week will be the last Sunday of the season of Easter, followed thereafter by Pentecost, by that great celebration of the Holy Spirit. And you'll notice that we're reading a lot from the book of Acts in particular, because Acts gives us these accounts of what happens to the disciples who followed Jesus after the resurrection, after Easter. Today, Betsy read for us two different passages that we often overlook about how they live together, right? Like we read all of these amazing stories about the baptism of the eunuch or Paul's transformation or a healing here, but these two passages from the end of chapter 2 and chapter 4 give us a description of what their daily life was like. A day in the life, if you will, of the disciples of Jesus. Acts 2:42 says, the believers, the disciples of Jesus, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, devoted themselves to community, to sharing meals, and to praying together. They were all united, and they shared everything. They would sell pieces of property and possessions and distribute the proceeds to everyone who needed them. Now, one of the things that I always encourage you to do when there are divided up texts, it's helpful to look at what's in between, what we're not reading on a Sunday morning, and why it is that Pastor left those off, right? So if you were to continue reading between these two stories, it's great. On the one hand, you have the story of Barnabas. You've heard of Barnabas, right? His name means encourager. And Barnabas, this great story, is somebody who sold all of his property and gave it all to the Christian community, and then just went off in ministry following Paul eventually. Or in chapter 4, it's followed with this great story. It says the same thing, right? They sold everything and they possessed it together. And then there's this story of Annas and Sapphira, right? Who lied. They said they gave what they could to the community, but they actually had like a 401k that they didn't tell anybody out about, right? And it's this story of condemnation of them, not because they didn't give everything up, but because they lied, because they were not honest with the community. We skip these parts of Acts sometimes. To be honest, a little convenient to have them come up as we're getting ready for a capital campaign. I'm not suggesting that any of you sell your houses for the capital campaign. That might be a bit much. I don't think we're called to do everything exactly the same as the apostles did it, right? I don't think many of us are called to sell our homes and our cars and leave behind our kids and our spouses and go travel as traveling missionaries. Some of us might be, but I don't think we all are. But the spirit of what we hear in Acts is really important. The spirit of the life that they lived together is still what we are called to today. And We can jump all the way back to Genesis 1, right? Genesis 1, God makes night and God makes day. And God looks at night and day and God says, what? It's good. And God makes plants and things that grow and crops and trees. And God looks at all the plants and crops and trees and God says, it's good. God makes animals and creepy crawlies and worms that come out when it rains. And God looks at the animals and the creepy crawlies and the worms that come out with rain. And God says, and then God makes humankind. God makes a human. And God looks at this human that God has made, and God says, no, not yet. God says it is not good for the human being to be alone. And then God makes a second one. And then God says it is good. We are created from the very moment of creation. We are made for community. We are made for each other. We are made to move through this life not as individuals, but as part of something bigger than ourselves. Yes, family and spouses and children and parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, but also neighbors and friends and confidants and people we can rely on. Saw this week a fantastic story wherein a daughter was watching her mother, and her mother went next door and asked for a cup of sugar. She said, next door said, I need a cup of sugar, I'm baking and I'm out. Borrows a cup of sugar, comes back home. And her daughter says, we have plenty of sugar. Why'd you get some from the neighbors? Her mom says, yeah, we have plenty of most things, but they often don't. And I knew it wouldn't cost them anything to give me sugar. And then when they need something, they can feel comfortable coming over here. When's the last time you borrowed a cup of milk or a cup of sugar from your neighbor? Right? When's the last time you went into your neighbor's garage and borrowed some tools because you're working on a project instead of just going to Home Depot and buying something new for yourself? We're made for each other. We're made for community. We're made to get through it together, to rely on one another, to need one another. And all of these little things add up. I love the way Paul says it to the Philippians. Paul says this: don't do anything for selfish purposes, but with humility, think of others as better than yourselves. Instead of watching out for what is best for you, watch out for what's best for your neighbor. Oh. How often do we ask, what's in it for me? As we look at changes in tax code, as we look at what needs to be done for schools, as we look at anything, we say, oh, what's in it for me? The person who says, and you've heard it and I've heard it, why should I pay a school tax? I don't have any kids in this school district. Why should I pay for welfare? I worked hard to get what I have. Don't ask what is best for yourself, says Paul, but in humility, ask what is best for your neighbor. We live such isolated lives, don't we? It's so hard to even see anyone as our neighbor. They're strangers that we meet. This is what happens as we move into cities and more congested areas. There's too many people for us to love everybody, so we just love nobody. That's the flip. And it's killing us. It's literally killing us. In New York, last week, subway. Week before, last week, a homeless man was on the subway. He didn't have great mental health, because it's hard to have great mental health when you're homeless. And he didn't behave quite right, because it's hard to behave quite right when you don't have great mental health and you're homeless. And the people on the subway asked first not, what can I do to help my neighbor? They didn't ask first, what can I do to take care of this man who's obviously having a hard time? They didn't ask first, how can I love my neighbor? They said, what's in it for me? I better protect myself. He hadn't done anything violent toward anyone, but the response was to act violently first before they could act violently. And the man was killed by people who were defending themselves. Who is my neighbor? Asked Jesus. We are created for community. When we don't see the people that we encounter daily as our neighbors, we are literally killing ourselves. It's not a figure of speech. Yes, loneliness is the biggest mental health epidemic in the world right now. Yes, but also we're literally killing one another because we can't live in community with each other. Because we can't put the needs of someone else ahead of our own. We take on first this cultural ideal that I have to take care of myself and my people first. And who cares what happens to anyone else? And we call ourselves a Christian nation. The biblical ideal is exactly the opposite. In humility, don't think too well of yourself. Don't ask what's best for me, but instead ask, what is best for my neighbor? None of them would say, this is mine, about their possessions. For the community of believers was one in heart and mind. Do you think that means that they agreed on everything? Do you think? Do you know any group larger than one that has agreed on everything? The only way to get a group of people who agree on everything is to have a group of one. It's the only way. That's true of churches too. It's true in families. But what we agree on is what's most important. That I love you and you are my neighbor. And the discussion we have about the disagreements we might have begin there. They begin with, I love you. And I know you love me. And I know you are acting out of your faith and out of your love. And then we can have a discussion about what we do next. Maybe we disagree about the best way to love our neighbor, about the best way to care for our community, but we have the same goal, the same mind, the same heart. As we move through Easter and we ask what it means for us to be Easter people, I think it's really important that every time we see these descriptions of the apostles after the resurrection, they are together. They are with one another. They gather in prayer and in worship and for meals and just because they enjoy being with one another. They get out of their homes and they spend time with one another. You, dear friend, are created for community. Knock on your neighbor's door. Learn to ask for help. Learn to rely and to lean on people other than yourself. To tell you the truth, it's scary. All right, one more thing. All right, so last fall, Megan and I both had COVID at the same time, right? If you've had COVID, you know that you pretty much become useless when you get it. And so the two of us were useless together at the same time. Normally what happens is I get sick and Megan takes care of me. And that's it. She doesn't usually get sick. But we were both out with COVID. And we committed ourselves that if somebody offers help, we're going to say yes. And if somebody says, how can I help? We're going to find some way to say yes. And so people brought us soup. And neighbors took care of us, and church members took care of us. And it was humbling to not be able to do everything yourself. And it felt really vulnerable. But I felt closer to those people than I ever had before. Dear friends, we are Easter people, resurrection people, living a new life and called to live in a new way. Take the risk. Step out in vulnerability and learn to rely and to live into the real meaning of community.